Jo d'entrada, abans fèiem una broma fora i deia, jo no sé res de Grècia i no sé res d'economia, no? I un professor em diu, bé, com els economistes, en definitiva, no? Doncs segurament és veritat, no? Tenim un problema que és econòmic però que també és polític perquè afecta el conjunt de les estructures de l'eurozona i per tant com en la sessió anterior ha deixat entreveure el senyor Aldahag, els plans d'ajustament que s'han produït a Grècia, diu ell, o deia ell, són els únics possibles, o eren els únics possibles i els únics aplicables i per tant aquest reajustament s'havia de fer com s'ha fet en definitiva. Bé, en tot cas aquest és el nucli de la sessió d'avui per discutir sobretot des de centrar-ho en el sentit de dir realment ho sabíem quina era la situació econòmica en la qual es trobava Grècia? Realment hi ha hagut un maquillatge de les dades, de com estava el dèficit grec i com estava l'economia grega? Ha estat en aquest sentit una irresponsabilitat? Quines semblances pot haver-hi entre aquesta crisi que vivim ara amb la crisi que es va produir, per exemple, a l'Argentina el 2001, que també va deixar els argentins en una situació completament anorreats. Per tant, veure en bona mesura, en primer lloc fer una diagnosi de en quina situació ens trobem i sobretot veure quines poden ser les solucions o les sortides a la greu situació econòmica que viu Grècia. Per fer això, quan vaig parlar amb l'Edward Hugh, que faig un parèntesi perquè ahir no li vaig fer un reconeixement que hauria d'haver fet en públic, en el fons aquest seminari s'inspira en una idea que ell em va donar a mi en un cafè del Poble Nou. Estàvem un dia conversant amb un amic comú, amb uns amics comuns que ens van presentar i ell insistia molt en la possibilitat de fer una discussió com aquesta i per tant li vull agrair públicament aquesta iniciativa seva. Bé, doncs per fer això ell em va suggerir també dues persones, la doctora Miranda Xafa, que és estratega d'inversió a la companyia IG Partners i exdirectora executiva suplent de la Junta Directiva del Fons Monetari Internacional i exassessora del govern grec mateix, i el senyor Phillip Ammerman, que és cofundador i director gerent de Navigator Consulting Group i que a tots dos els dono les gràcies per haver thank you for coming to Barcelona and attend this meeting. Tenen 30 minuts cadascú per fer la seva exposició, o sigui, vostè primer, sisplau.
My presentation will be in three parts. First of all, I will discuss why the euro area credit spreads remain so wide and why Greece is an outlier compared to the rest of the EMU periphery. Secondly, I will briefly compare the programs of Greece, Ireland and Portugal, the three countries that are now under EU, IMF supported programs. And I will discuss the issue of whether some kind of debt restructuring can be avoided in getting out of this crisis. And finally, I will discuss whether a comprehensive solution to the euro area debt crisis is really underway or whether more is needed to resolve this crisis. So, first, if you look at the credit spreads, first I have to apologize because I forgot to change the scale on this graph The Greek spread is now at 1,400, and the scale only goes to 1,000. So you should imagine this red line going to 1,400, which is beyond the scale of this graph. So the market has differentiated between different credits. You can see at the beginning of this graph back in 2007, before the global financial crisis broke out, how all of the euro area countries borrowed at about the same interest rate. The spread between Greek 10-year bonds and German bonds was as low as 40 basis points. It's now 1,400 basis points. So there was clearly market misconception about the credit risk. Markets believed that there is no credit risk in the euro area. That was clearly wrong. But there was also a problem for the regulators, because Greek bonds, German bonds, and the bonds of every country in the euro area shared the same zero risk weight in bank balance sheets. So why is Greece an outlier? There are many reasons, and I've summarized them in this graph. First, it has the highest debt and deficit, public sector deficit in the European Union. Its fiscal data are unreliable and keep being revised. It has a poor track record of fiscal adjustment. There were delays in the IMF EU financed adjustment program. There are concerns in the market that budget cuts could spark social unrest, and we already see quite a few demonstrations taking place in Athens and elsewhere. And finally, there is an issue of competitiveness, very important issue. Growth prospects are very poor. Greece has had negative GDP growth in the past 3 years. And the Doing Business report of the World Bank ranks Greece 109th out of 155 countries. It is an unattractive destination for direct investment. Greece also has the highest aging costs in the euro area. These estimates predate a pension reform that took place last year, which, however, did not solve the problem. So there has to be a second reform of the pension system, which will be coming up hopefully this year. You mentioned Argentina. In this graph you can see, I copied this from Bloomberg, so I did not make this up. Already from January 2010, which is 5 months before Greece asked for financial assistance from the EU and from the IMF, already markets were comparing Greece to Argentina and to Russia, both of which defaulted. So what went wrong in Greece? First of all, the factors that were driving growth in the good times being the period from 2001, when Greece joined the euro area, to 2007, when the global financial crisis broke out. The factors that were driving growth during this good period were largely temporary. First, there was tremendous decline in interest rates in Greece in the run-up to EMU, and also following entry of Greece in the euro area. Interest rates went from the low 20% to the German level of 4% or so in the space of just a few years. Second, there was rapid growth in private sector credit after the financial sector was liberalized in the 90s. And so there was a credit boom, to some extent a housing boom, not nearly as bad as in Ireland or even Spain, but credit growth was double-digit during this period. Third, there was a lot of EU-funded infrastructure spending ahead of the 2004 Olympics. And finally, already from the early 90s, there was huge immigration into Greece from the former Soviet bloc. And that provided sort of cheap labor. Many of the construction workers in Greece came from the former Soviet bloc. They were from Albania and other countries in the neighborhood. So a return to above average growth rates, which prevailed in this good period from 2001 to 2007, is very unlikely without structural reforms to raise potential output. During this good period, convergence of living standards was achieved mainly through an unsustainable increase in debt. You can see from this graph that living standards in Greece converged almost fully with those in the European Union, the 27 countries, and to a large extent also with the euro area. But this convergence was based on borrowing, both public sector borrowing and private sector borrowing through the banking system, which financed a credit expansion. Of course, as known, the crisis has spread to the EMU periphery. And so in May 2010, the EU created the temporary rescue mechanism, the European Financial Stability Facility, which was co-financed by the IMF. In November of the same year, Ireland received emergency financing of about 68 billion from the EFSF to recapitalize its banks and keep its deficit under control. And in April last month, Portugal came under intense pressure and also agreed to a rescue package from the EFSF amounting to 78 billion euros. So the global financial crisis essentially has morphed into a sovereign debt crisis. And this was the result both of monumental market failure. As I mentioned, market participants did not believe there was any credit risk in the euro area. That was wrong. There was regulatory failure because of the treatment of euro area bonds by the regulators. And there was also institutional failure because the Stability Pact failed to impose fiscal discipline. So obviously a systemic solution is needed to resolve the sovereign debt crisis in the euro area. Because of the banking crisis in some countries like Ireland, the public sector has taken over debts of the private sector. So the debt issuing schedule of euro area governments is very heavy, even this year. So the crisis is far from over. And markets are concerned whether the market can accommodate all this additional debt issuance to finance the still high deficits of euro area governments. At the same time, the ECB has started a round of interest rate increases in May with a 25 basis points hike in the short-term interest rates, which of course have had an impact on long-term rates, which are set by the market. And so concerns about fiscal sustainability have been compounded by the increased funding costs of governments. So a permanent solution is needed. Without that, I think the euro will remain under pressure. So now I come to the second part of the presentation, which is the programs for Greece, Ireland, and Portugal, and whether these programs can really avoid the debt restructuring at the end. It's important to clarify that the origin of the crisis in the three countries is very different. In Greece, the problem is a government that is far too big and intervenes far too much in the economy. Greece is more of a post-Soviet economy with a very large public sector, with 52 public enterprises and a host of public entities. The government was unable last year to roll over its debt, so it lost market access, and that's why it had to resort to the EU and the IMF to be able to borrow to finance its expenditures. By now, Greece has been downgraded to junk status. Greece is rated as single B, which is where Argentina was rated when it defaulted. By contrast, Ireland and Portugal remain investment grade credits. In Ireland, the origins of the problem was very different. The banking sector grew to 500% of GDP. So in a sense, Ireland is like Iceland. In Iceland, the banking sector grew to 1,000% of GDP. So in Iceland, the problem was even bigger. But I remember in 2008, when Iceland blew up, we used to say at the IMF, what's the difference between Iceland and Ireland? And the answer was a letter. The banks were unable to roll over the maturing obligations, so they became fully dependent on the ECB for liquidity support. And so the fragile banking sector is there the key threat to public finances. So in Greece, the problem started with the public sector and was transmitted to the banks. In Ireland, the problem started with the banks and was transmitted to the public sector. In Portugal, again, the problem is different. It's the slowest growing economy in the euro area. Its growth rate has averaged 1% in the past decade. And it is this slow growth and competitiveness problems that have created problems in the public sector with a growing deficit, and also in the banks with an increase in non-performing loans. So the program objectives are very different in the three countries. Each program is tailor-made to address the problems that are specific to each of these three countries. So in Greece, the key objective is to reduce the public sector deficit as rapidly as possible, in part through structural fiscal reforms like pension reform and public enterprise reform, and also by improving tax collection, because tax compliance is another big problem in Greece. At the same time, the program aims to liberalize markets, to open up markets to competition by reforming labor markets, improving the business climate, reducing red tape, to restart growth. In Ireland, the program aims primarily at restoring the banking sector to health. The previous panel talked about that. The intention is to restructure and to recapitalize banks. There is a National Asset Management Agency that has been set up to take over the bad assets of the banks. And so there is a bad bank, good bank solution in Ireland. In Portugal, the main objective is to intensify competition and to reduce excessive profits in the non-tradable sector, including electricity and transport, through regulatory reform and through accelerated privatization. And a big difference between the three countries is that Greece has by far the largest debt burden. And in Ireland, specifically, when you hear that Ireland has a deficit of 32% of GDP, that sounds really ominous, but that reflects one-off transfers from the government to the banking sector to recapitalize the banking sector. So the deficit will come back down next year. So these are major differences between these countries. Focusing now on Greece, you can see the level of the deficit reached more than 15% in 2009, which was the worst year. And then from May 2010, the EU IMF program has been applied, and so the deficit is starting to come down, but still Greece has a long way to go before reducing its deficit to below 3% of GDP, which is its obligation under the euro area rules. But the public debt ratio will only stabilize under the EU IMF program at a very high rate of nearly 160% of GDP in 2013. Historically, no country has been able to fully repay its debt when its debt has exceeded 100% of GDP. So no one in the markets believes that Greece will fully honor its obligations. So some in the market believe that debt restructuring in Greece is imminent. But Greece first needs to generate a primary surplus. You can see in this graph that Greece still this year, even if the program is fully implemented, Greece will still have a primary deficit. So Greece is still paying the entire interest bill, the debt service on the debt, with borrowed money, and that's why the debt keeps rising. In order to sit at the negotiating table with creditors, Greece has to have something to offer, so it would need to have a primary surplus so that it can pay at least part of the interest bill without resorting to further borrowing. And this is why it makes no sense for Greece to restructure debt in the sense of reducing the debt level at this point. So I should also mention that the adjustment task for Greece is to go from a primary deficit of 10% of GDP in 2009 to a surplus, a primary surplus of 6% of GDP, which is what is needed to stabilize the debt. So Greece needs to go from -10 to +6. So the adjustment task is 16 percentage points of GDP, which is huge. But even if there is a debt restructuring now, Greece's adjustment task will not be significantly affected. Market access will only be assured if the level of debt is viewed by the market as being sustainable. In other words, as I said, when a sizable primary surplus has been achieved. And early debt restructuring will simply slow the momentum for reform in Greece without meaningfully reducing the adjustment task. On the creditor side, the European banks are not ready to take the hit. They hold a huge amount of Greek debt in their portfolios, and they are just not ready to take the hit because they have not set aside enough capital to suffer the losses. Also, a haircut of, say, 30% on Greek government bonds would wipe out most of the capital of Greek banks. The EU IMF loan, which amounted to 110 billion, which is the biggest loan in the history, includes 10 billion that has been set aside for bank capital support. But this 10 billion will not be enough to cover the losses of the Greek banking sector in case there is a 30% haircut imminently. And in addition to that, Greek pension funds, which are already broke, also hold a large amount of Greek debt, about 26 billion of Greek debt, and they would also suffer massive losses. So a haircut now is not a solution. Time is very pressing because gradually the ECB will be forced to normalize its policies. It will need to return to auctions of short-term liquidity. Right now, the ECB provides an infinite amount of liquidity to member banks. At some point, it will have to return to auctions of a specific amount of liquidity every week, which means that some banks may not be able to get all the liquidity they need. Also, eventually, it will have to return to an A- minimum rating of the accepted collateral. When that happens, Greece, with its single B rating, will lose access to the ECB, and the banking sector will collapse. And also, the so-called securities market program, under which the ECB is buying Greek, Portuguese, and Irish debt in the secondary market, also will have to come to an end. As talk of an imminent Greek debt restructuring has intensified in recent weeks, the ECB has stated that if there is any kind of restructuring of Greek debt, it will stop accepting Greek debt as collateral in its refinancing operations. Now, the IMF EU program was assuming that Greece will reaccess markets next year, and that in the 2 years, 2012 and 2013, it will raise 65 billion from capital markets, which is highly unlikely to happen with the spread now going through the roof. By coincidence, 65 billion is also the amount of Greek government bonds that are falling due in this critical period of 2012-2013. And so the idea has been floated that either Greece needs an additional loan in addition to the 110, half of which has been disbursed and half roughly remains undisbursed, or if the debt were to be reprofiled, meaning that the bonds maturing in 2012 and 13 were the repayment of these debts were postponed for the future, then that would cover the financing gap that will open up because of the inability of Greece to reaccess capital markets. In any case, the key ingredient to any solution to Greece's crisis is the implementation of a medium-term fiscal consolidation plan that has been announced this week. The Troika is now in Athens reviewing the details of this plan, which eventually will go to a parliamentary vote in the coming weeks. What is the potential for contagion to Spain? I think that the chances of the rescue package for Spain are about 50-50. The fiscal problem of Spain is not as serious as it is in Greece. Its banking problem is not as deep as it is in Ireland. And the external competitiveness problem is not as bad as in Portugal. But Spain has an issue in all three areas. And what it shares in common with these three countries is a heavy reliance on external borrowing. I mean, Italy also has a large budget deficit and debt, but it borrows from itself. It does not rely on external funding, and this is what differentiates Italy from Spain. On the positive side, in Spain, the Cajas problem appears to be manageable, with a 15 billion recapitalization that is planned before September. So now I come to the third and final part of my presentation, which is the euro area reaction to this crisis. The crisis response has been piecemeal. The authorities were behind the curve and were running behind the markets. There were months of bickering before the loan to Greece and the IMF involvement was agreed at the EU level in May of 2010. And as the crisis spread to other euro area members, the EFSF was set up as a Luxembourg-based SPV, special purpose vehicle, with a mandate to borrow up to 440 billion in the market to rescue countries that were at risk of default. But about half of that, less than half of that money needed to be set aside in order to secure a AAA rating for this SPV, for this special purpose vehicle. So the full amount is not accessible, and there are fears in the market that if Spain needs to be rescued, that there's not enough money. And the EFSF loan to Ireland was agreed only after the ECB pulled the plug on Ireland when liquidity provision reached 83% of Ireland's GDP. So the Greek, Irish, and Portuguese rescue packages have obviously reduced the risk of a sovereign default to close to zero in the near term, but successful adjustment in the so-called PIGS, Portugal, Ireland, and Greece, is not guaranteed. A fiscal union with unlimited intra-governmental transfers is out of the question. Germany and the other surplus countries would never agree to that. And so the EU needs to develop a mechanism to deal with sovereign default. And most importantly, such a mechanism needs to shield the financial sector from the fallout of a sovereign default. Obviously, a systemic solution is needed. As I said, the euro area still has a very heavy debt issuance schedule that will keep markets focused firmly on the ability of the euro area to contain the sovereign debt pressures. Concerns about fiscal sustainability have been compounded by the gradual increase in long-term interest rates. And in the absence of a permanent and systemic solution, the euro will probably weaken further in coming months. Why is an orderly debt workout needed? It is needed first to prevent taxpayer bailout of member states by having private investors share in the losses. It is needed to enforce market discipline by reducing the moral hazard. And it's also needed in order to minimize disruptions in the real economy by avoiding a protracted debt negotiation like the one that took place in Argentina. So what actually was the process by which European leaders agreed to the solution that they proposed? First, there was the Merkel-Sarkozy communiqué from Deauville in October of last year, which was the first hint that losses would be in store for private creditors in future debt workouts. This sparked a lot of reaction from the market. The spreads immediately widened. And so EU leaders, to appease the markets, made a statement to the effect that existing debt would not be affected by any debt restructuring, that this statement only referred to future debts contracted after 2013. At the EU Council meeting in late October of 2010, the heads of state reached unanimous agreement to a limited treaty reform, which refers to a revision of Article 122 to permit the Council to grant assistance to member states to maintain financial stability. And this was the legal basis for creating the permanent mechanism, the European Stability Mechanism, that will succeed the temporary mechanism in the middle of 2013. So 3 issues were decided at the very important March summit. First, it was decided to expand EFSF resources to make the full 440 billion available for lending. Secondly, as I said, to create the permanent European Stability Mechanism. And third, the Pact for the Euro, which essentially refers to closer economic and financial surveillance of member states, stricter enforcement of the Stability Pact, with semi-automatic sanctions imposed on members that do not comply with the budget targets. What are the role and the functions of the European Stability Mechanism? First, to assist member countries in financial difficulty through the provision of loans, provided that the euro area's financial stability at large is at stake and that the country's debt is sustainable. If the country's debt is not judged to be sustainable, then the country would need to initiate negotiations with its creditors to agree on a restructuring program. And this is in line with the German view that private investors must share in the losses. A very important clause says that ESM loans would have seniority over private bondholders. What is the view of the markets on these decisions? First, the commitment that existing debt would not be subject to losses is just not credible. It is the existing debt that is the problem. It's not the future debt. Secondly, the seniority of official creditors under the ESM will make it hard, if not impossible, for the heavily indebted countries to reaccess capital markets. If in 2013 the ESM continues to lend to some of the countries in the periphery, there is no incentive for private market participants to invest in the bonds of these countries because they will be treated as second-class citizens, so to speak, that if there is a default down the road, then the official creditors will be repaid first, and the bondholders will have to share whatever remains. The third problem is that the EU is not really addressing the systemic interdependence between the banking and the sovereign crisis. The euro area needs proper stress tests to assess the need for additional capital for its banks. But this latest round of stress tests does not include a scenario of haircuts, because such haircuts are not on the agenda. And so we don't really know how much new capital European banks will need. The Gross-Mayer proposal, in my personal opinion, is the most comprehensive solution that has been proposed to resolve permanently the euro area debt crisis. This proposal involves a two-step procedure. In a first step, the current temporary mechanism would offer bondholders of the GIP countries, the PIGS, a debt exchange with EFSF bonds at the market price prevailing when each of these countries agreed on a program with the EU and the IMF. In a second step, after the EFSF acquires all this debt, it would assess whether the debt of each of these countries is sustainable. If the debt is sustainable, the EFSF would write down the value of its claims to each of these countries to the applicable discount. If the debt is not sustainable, then the EFSF would lower the interest charged to each of these countries to the level that's necessary to ensure debt sustainability. A key condition for this approach to be successful is that the EFSF claims would need to not be senior to private claims. In other words, official credits should be provided on a pari passu basis with private bondholders. The benefits of this proposal are that first, it avoids default that would lead to a disorderly adjustment and to pressures on the euro, but it also, at the other extreme, avoids fiscal union, which would undermine the contractual basis of the euro area and would alienate the German public. It would do this by providing a rule by which credit losses would be divided between debtors, creditors, and taxpayers. No group would bear the full burden. Finally, it would permit a restoration of market access by providing official financing on a pari passu basis with the private creditors. I worked at the IMF in the 80s, and my main task was to follow the adjustment programs of Latin America. The Gross-Mayer proposal is very similar to the Brady bonds that ultimately resolved the Latin American debt crisis. A recent book by the former US Treasury Secretary Nicholas Brady quotes a Mexican official who said that it took courage and vision to decide a strategy that would solve the problem in an orderly fashion. The alternative was an eventual debt repudiation that would have created a very messy situation. But obviously it took 7 years from the start of the crisis in 1982, of the Latin American debt crisis, until the Brady bonds were issued in 1989. So 7 years from the start of the crisis to the permanent solution. During that time, the banks had built enough of a cushion, enough of a capital cushion to withstand the losses, and also the countries, the debtor countries, had achieved a very significant amount of debt consolidation and debt a reduction in the fiscal deficits. Thank you.